everyone. I'm so glad you could join us tonight. We're right in the middle of the densest period for Egyptology at Brown that I ever remember in my 8 years here. So those of you who joined us this weekend got a lot of Egyptology. Those of you who join us tonight get some more Egyptology. And if you still are in the mood, I invite you to join us to see Gods of Egypt on Wednesday night. It should be a great blast. But tonight, we have the great good fortune for a much more scholarly take on things than the Gods of Egypt. We're joined tonight by Professor John Baines, relatively recently retired from Oxford. John needs really no introduction. I don't know if I could fit one into an hour's lecture if I took an hour, but I will stop to mention a couple of his more recent books. He's recently written Visual and Written Culture, which is a collection of new and old essays to which I turn all the time. There's really no other Egyptologist working in the world who controls so well both the textual and the material data, and material including archaeological and art historical. His work is an inspiration across the board. But also, even more recently, high culture and experience. And to show your breadth, you're also currently working on biographies of ancient Egyptians. So I've known you for, well, since I was a kid, since I've been with many of the people in this room, and I bring my own kids to watch you tonight, as one does when rock stars are in the room. So it's really, I hope you will join me in welcoming John, who will be speaking to us tonight about visibility, place, and movement, ancient Egyptian images and their contexts.
You understand that, I don't. Well, thank you very much, Laurel. I'm very sorry about the rock star business, but there it goes. So I'll talk, obviously, mainly about ancient Egyptian images, but there will be a scattering of things that come from elsewhere, which I think helps us to think about things comparatively, and it's also it relates to particular problems that we have. Now, the basic question I want to address is focused around the human body, but not exclusively, and it's about how people represent people, and people includes members of the human and the divine worlds, and then who gets to see them, and what's done with them. So who gets to see them is about the matter of access and things like this. And what is done with them is done mostly to objects that are three-dimensional. So I'm mainly talking about statuary, but actually the pictures I use are mainly two-dimensional. They are pictures of pictures. So it's convenient to begin with a couple of examples which are very indirect. These are very early objects. Most of my material will be 3rd millennium, but I have later material too. And this shows you two of these objects called tags, which represent clearly in the left-hand case a year of a king's reign. And you've got in the bottom right-hand corner of that image a picture of a building which has the hieroglyphs for two goddesses. One of them is an indirect representation of the goddess by means of a crown, and hence it implies something about how she associates with her status and things like that. Probably this object will signify that the king does something like visit the temple of that goddess. The other one shows a temple enclosure, and I'll leave it at that now because we'll come back to them. And so here, the left hand, the map there, is just to show you that I have material from all over Egypt in this lecture. From the Egyptians face towards the south. So if you start from the south, you have the site of Elephantine. The rings there, or ovals, don't always hit the sites in question because that map didn't always have that name on it. But you've got major material of the 3rd millennium which goes all the way from the first cataract of the Nile in the south to quite near the Mediterranean coast. That's indirect material. The pictures that I just showed you are pictures of sites in the delta, but they don't come from the delta. They come from a Abydos, which is about 2/3 of the way down. Now on the right, you've got a couple of pre-dynastic images. These will be 3500, that sort of date. And you've got a flint hippo. The flint hippo, these are extraordinary flint objects which were made into pictures of animals in particular. And you have a dominance of images of animals in earlier periods, very many fewer pictures of humans, and then that changes. And then you have a mask. And the mask, of course, is something to do with performance of some type. And it is very striking that we have a certain number, not large numbers, of pre-dynastic, prehistoric masks. We have very few masks from dynastic Egypt. I don't think that means they weren't used. It probably means that they were made of materials that don't survive or were used in contexts that don't survive. So they're just there to sort of remind us that things go back a very long way in Egypt, let's say. And there we have a picture of a tomb which dates to the late 3rd millennium. And it's there, you obviously can't see any images there. It's there for the back of the court on the right, which is highlighted here, where there is a long biographical text. It's matched by a second text on the other side, but that doesn't concern us now. But there you have the tomb owner and his wife, and they're facing the viewer, facing the visitor to the tomb. And there are two crucial things about this. This man, untypically for a local leader at this date, doesn't give any roles for himself that are administrative or to do with expeditions and other accomplishments that people would write about. Instead, he is a priest. It's his primary role. And that is given there. And his wife's short hair is typical of priestesses of the goddess Hathor. So she too is a member of cult personnel in some way. Now, the crucial phrase is on the left there. It's not a phrase, it's 3 couplets of verse, if you put it that way. And there is the translation. So he claims to have lived 100 years. And he was the possessor of a ka. We'll come back to the ka as we go along. The ka is some sort of principle of vitality, we can say, among other things. He spent a great part of his lifetime as the overseer of priests, that means the high priest, we could say, of the goddess Hathor of Kusai, a place in the middle of Egypt. He would enter into Hathor, into her presence, and see her and perform for her ritual with his own arms. So he would actually touch the image of the goddess. And that is something that is therefore his distinctive claim to status. We don't have parallels for this text. That's always the problem when there aren't very many texts. But we have plenty of other texts which would show that people say what is most important about them in these texts. In the other text of this particular man, interestingly, he mentions that he had been accused of a crime which must have been so important that he couldn't conceal it. So you can see how these things really do convey people's identities. So his identity as being somebody who can go into the presence of the deity and touch the deity is vital. And the fact that we don't have other texts like this doesn't fit with the fact that we have plenty of other people who held the title of overseer of priests. Probably there would be 1 or 2 reasons for that, but basically what I would expect is the other people have other accomplishments that they wish to talk about, and he happened not to. But we should therefore assume that the people of the very highest status in the local communities, at least, will be people who have access to the deity and to the image of the god, and the average person will not. So the access is restricted. And we now move to Renaissance Germany for our parallel. And that's a very famous painting indeed, the so-called Crucifixion of Grunewald, very doubtful attribution. And this, I don't know if anyone here has seen this painting. It is truly astonishing because that is about 3 meters wide. It is absolutely colossal. And So that is how you would see the picture about 360 days of the year. But it's not the whole point. At Christmas, it will be opened out. And so what you had there was simply the front panels showing the resurrection. Sorry, let me get it right, the crucifixion. There you have the Annunciation, the Nativity, and the Resurrection. And so this is an even larger object once it's been opened out. It is truly enormous. And you've got the empty grave underneath. But we still haven't got to the point here. The point is that on the 17th of January, it will be opened out to reveal that. And so here is one of the most famous Western paintings, which is shown mainly, you see, actually, what you mostly see is the crucifixion scene, but it is actually tertiary in importance. What is really vital is the statues that are in there. And so the statues show the local saints, and they are opened out on the Saints' Day. And so we have to think that there is a hierarchy which is very local to Isenheim in Alsace, in which what matters is statuary, and Western art historians, it seems to me, often confuse us by placing painting higher than anything else in the hierarchy. Yet the three-dimensional image is what counts, and as you can see, it's gilded. And you've got Christ and the 12 apostles in the predella, the bottom of the altarpiece, which again must be the highest status and most important side of that too. So therefore the image in 3 dimensions, which will receive some sort of special treatment, is what counts. We go back to Egypt. We don't have, I believe, a single cult image known from ancient Egypt. Now that's not surprising because the cult images were small. We do have, we have spurious information about their size, but they would typically perhaps be about that size, 50 centimeters. And they would be made of precious materials. They were very often made of mixed materials, and they would have included a lot of organic material, and so they would be very vulnerable. They would need to be renewed. And we have, in fact, texts about renewing cult images. And they were in temple sanctuaries, which were all desecrated in early Christian times. And so we don't have them. But we do have this one here, which is a candidate for being a cult image, but on balance probably isn't. So this is a statue of a hawk. And it's got a very, very simple body. As you can see, it's almost as if it's a shaped piece of stone, except it's made of copper. And then it has this gilded head with obsidian eyes, extremely rare, and the feathers on top. The feathers show that this is a multi-period object. Those feathers could not have been added before about 1900 BC or possibly a bit later, but the object itself is almost certainly older. And if you look at the front of it, you can see 2 slots in the plinth. I think that's clear, isn't it? And that suggests that there was actually a statuette of the king, which would have slotted into there. But the crucial image we now have on the left there, it stood on a pole. Now, if it stood on a pole, you can't really imagine that being a permanent solution to performing the cult, because apart from anything else, the thing would be kept in a shrine. So this suggests this is actually a portable image, which will be used for some sort of rituals. It's obviously a fantastically important one, but it still hasn't got us to a cult image. So we will come back to that problem. But the other thing I want to take from this one is, 2 things. One is the use of precious materials, and the other is the fact that it is a weird object. Cult images throughout the world are often weird. They don't conform to normal conventions. So now I want to think about how far you actually can represent bodies and whether there are things that will make you not represent bodies. And we go to China for this. So here are early Bronze Age Chinese vessels, and Chinese art of this period eschews the human form pretty much entirely. There are always exceptions to any statement, but those are typical vessels of the very highest quality from Bronze Age China, and what is important to them is their patterned decoration, but they are animated, or rather the left-hand one is, by the presence of these eyes, which make them kind of stare at you. And then there is a whole discussion as to what that means. It's not that they couldn't have had images of living beings. Sorry, let's just add there that you do have dragons there. So there are identifiable beings, but although there they are, they're probably, they're obviously invented beings. Nobody's ever met a dragon. We go about 1,000 km southwest from where those were found, and we find this extraordinary bronze statue of a man from a civilization which is contemporary with the previous ones, but it was kind of cast out of the Chinese tradition, and so the idea that you would represent the human figure is what foreigners do in this period, but not Chinese people. So there are choices involved, and the representation of the human figure is a sensitive matter that people may not want to do. That continues in another sense as far as 19th century Korea. Did anyone see the exhibition of Korean art in the Philadelphia Museum 2 or 3 years ago? It was worth seeing. So here you have a ceremony for the birthday of the king, and this is not the nicest example from the point of view of thinking about Egyptian art. There are conventions in 19th century Korea which look as if they came from ancient Egypt. But what is really striking about this is what I've highlighted there. There is a throne and something in front of it, but there is no human figure there. And that's because that's the king. You could not represent the king. So if you're really important, you can't be depicted. And all these people here are less important. They're the king's servants in one sense or another. Not only that, but if you look at the painting, you will see that the king is right at the back. The absence of the king is right at the back. And then you have these two screen walls, so that there are a number of separations between the outside world down here and what is actually going on, and then the person for whom it's all being done. And this is actually fairly typical of many civilizations. So we'll come back to this one again, indirectly, near the end, but here you have Min, the Egyptian god, and these are the oldest colossal statues anybody knows. There are 3 of them, that's 2 of the 3. They come from the Temple of Coptos, which is a bit north of Luxor, Thebes, and they show this very flat figure. You can see that on the side on the left. The statues were about 4 meters high originally, this god holds his phallus, and he is clearly very visible. He's the absolute opposite of the sort of point I've been making up to now. And as I say, we'll come back to Min just near the end. But roughly contemporary with those statues, you have here microscopic objects with human figures in 2 contexts. You've got pictures of a group of captives, it seems, on the left, a fragment of an ivory object here. And you've also got people carrying offerings and things like that on another fragment, which you have above. And then you have this extraordinary statuette of a woman. Now, the reason for choosing these is that they're wearing long clothes. So these people are fully dressed, and the woman is also wearing a shawl over her head, and she has bit hard to say whether, I guess probably she's got a 2-layer shawl or something like that. And there's every reason to suppose that clothing is very important and valuable. There are thousands of reasons for thinking this, yet as we go along we'll find less and less clothing involved. So by late pre-dynastic times, contemporary with those, well, Min was wearing something, he's wearing a belt, but that's all. As time goes along, you have the development of clothing, which surely goes back many thousands of years, and the more clothing you wear, the higher the prestige involved. You can get this clearly from later periods in Egypt. But nonetheless, the conventions, which we'll come to as we go along, point in the opposite direction. And here you've got probably an object which is roughly contemporary with the, within a generation or two with the previous one. And you have on the left 2 men who are nude and they are captives. They're being led along in an excruciating pose by a standard which symbolizes a deity. That's there. And on the right you have up here a captive who's being who's thrown to the ground. Then down here there is another I assume a very important captive, because he's shown at a large scale, who is in subjection. He's forced to bend forward and his arms are behind him and he's held by this person here. That person there is wearing a long patterned garment, and the pattern is probably an animal skin, and so he is probably shown at least at a slightly later date. Sorry, I'm highlighting that. The animal skin would have been the skin of a panther or a leopard. Whether that was true at this date, we can't be sure. But so these objects represent the idea that the person at the top of the hierarchy is the one who wears the clothes. Nudity is then a state of abjection of enemies, which is something that is known, again, in many societies. Now, these objects, these pallets, were used for, notionally used, for grinding eye paint. At least that's the prime use we think they had. And that was done in this area here. But these are ceremonial objects. They were never actually used. You can see that there's no trace of wear at that point. Well, you can just see that, I think. But we do have examples that have been used. And here are a couple of them. And they have this arms like this, and that is the hieroglyph, at a very slightly later date, of the Ka, this vital force which is passed down the generations through the treatment of the body. And so these actually come from almost certainly the beginning of the development of writing. There's too much connection for that not to be true. But at the same time, these privileges which are involved in ideas like the transmission of the Ka are being taken away from people. Perhaps these objects would have been used for rituals performed, particularly perhaps on the dead. So you would prepare the body for burial. We never get enough of a context of this to be able to reconstruct it. And then the eye paint that was produced, or would put perhaps on the wrappings rather than on the body itself, would help you to transmit the vital force which would bring rebirth in the next world. At the same time, it would bring qualities that go down the generations. It would probably benefit you. But here is another example that also bears clear signs of use, but lacks the Ka element and is square. It's without pictorial value. And that is, I think, because the pictorial value was being withdrawn from anyone who was below the very highest status, the king and the gods. And the latest object we have that's at all like that is that one. That's too big in the picture, but that's the way screens are. And that one has hieroglyphs on it. It's got the Ka sign, and then across the top it says life, duration, and power, which are 3 standard attributes of the king. So this is presumably an object that would have belonged to the king or been in the king's power, but it was found in the tomb of an elite at the site of Helwan, which is not where the very highest elites were buried, but people one down the scale from them. But it's the only thing like it that is known, and it is also visibly unused. So I would interpret this that you have a very short phase where the king might give people gifts of this sort, which would then ratify their status and their progression into the next world, and then that would finish. That would finish because the symbolic world is becoming ever more restricted. So then we have the most famous of all these objects, the Narmer palette, which will be a generation or two older than that last one, or maybe even a bit older still. And so that gives you the way that the representation of the body develops, and it has an enormous progeny in later periods in other forms. So the king is there wearing a very short and tight kilt. He has a bull's tail, so he's in some way associated with the idea of the power of a bull. And there are a number of details of his iconography which are very clearly known, attested from later periods. So although the Narmer palette itself was deposited at Hierakonpolis and nobody saw it again, we can safely say that it is using a repertory that did live on. Well, you could certainly do a whole lecture on the Narmer palette, so we won't. But it is worth just looking at the figures here. So the man whom he is about to smite, to kill, though he never actually does, is virtually nude. And just go back for a second, you'll see these two figures were probably meant to be represented as dead are nude. So death and defeat are represented by nudity. And then you've got his sandal bearer behind him who has minimal clothing, but special clothing. You've got this man in front of him here who is wearing a leopard skin. And so that's somebody who is not royal, but is of the very highest status. And the king shows his status with this rather skimpy but extremely muscle-bound clothing. And he is wearing some sort of a shirt in addition to the kilt. You can see that more clearly there. And mostly the king is about the only person who wears something like that. So clothing is brought down to a minimal state, and the meaning of the clothing is there in subtle features of the iconography, but I think it has ceased to relate to what people actually wear by this date. So you cannot from this point on say, well, the king went around with hardly any clothes on. The king, from the tomb of Tutankhamun, we have very elaborate, heavy garments, so that won't work. And there would have been, at roughly the same date, other ways of thinking about this, which then we don't have much material relating to it, but it's still valid. So you've got on the left an over life-size figure in a long cloak, and that's probably the king. That sort of stature didn't live on. And then you've got these very small objects on the right. These are typically about this size. And of those 5 shown there, you've got a man wearing a penis sheath. That is a sign of high status in this period. And it lives on a little bit later, but only a little bit. And then of the other 4, 3 are wearing cloaks, and the left-hand one, looks like a figure of the king. But I have my feeling that this is material of very varied date. It might be a later object. But anyway, the cloak is something which marks things like age and distinction and wisdom. We can produce examples for all of those. But cloaking the body is therefore a positive thing. It's And so you've got different developments going on at the same time, where nudity of certain types, semi-nudity, and a visible body work together. And then this is much simplified as it goes along. Here we have the simpler version. And these are these extraordinary wooden panels of Hezi-Re. So as you went into Hezi-Re's tomb, you saw the one on the left, and he is wearing a cloak there, and he's seated. On the whole, there's more status in being seated than standing. And he's also shown elderly. So the attributes of wisdom and things like that are associated with wearing quite a lot of clothing. The next one shows him with a fantastically beautiful body and not very much in the way of clothing. And by this date, jewelry has gone way out of fashion. And so people are not wearing much else apart from a garment. He's holding attributes, which are important attributes, but you start effectively developing the repertory, which then lives on for several centuries in the middle of the third millennium, from this extraordinarily plain and minimal style of showing people. Of course, the other point I would make here is that the actual value in the human body is clearly very great. The body is shown as being lean and muscular and toned and so on. And then we can make the same points about the king. This is contemporary with the last example. There is King Djoser, and his statue on the right shows him cloaked all over, and he has this extremely large beard, false beard, which signifies that he is in some way assimilated to a deity, and his wig also shows the same thing, and on top of the wig he has a headcloth, and the headcloth has solar associations. So you have very elaborate iconography here, which is probably to do with his passage into the next life or something like that. But in a way more relevant to what I'm talking about here is the one on the left. That's just the base of a colossal statue. And it's an extraordinary object because it's just about the only object we have where it's actually got a sculptor's signature on it, as you might call it. And there is another fragment of the same statue of the midriff area, which has it has an asymmetrical belt, and that has heads of a cow with necklaces descending from it. That's an ornament on the garment. And that's something which we can parallel also back to the Nama palette. And if you put that together, you get a statue looking something like that, more than 3 meters high. So this is the earliest colossal statue of a king that we have. It's just that it's in lots of pieces, or not enough pieces. And so the minimal clothing style is what is chosen if you want to express things like power, and which is also given by the various attributes he's holding, and so on. Well, that's just a brief survey of that sort of thing. We now go back to what we had right at the beginning and look at how this relates to where you see objects. So here you have 2 more of these tags. On the right you've got both the photograph and the drawing, and they show you on the right the sacred site of Sais in the Delta. The king visits Sais and he goes to the temple. The king is represented by that emblem there, that is the temple of Sais, and the boat above is the means of his transport to Sais, presumably. It could have further, I'm sure it does have further implications, but that's enough for now. On the left you have the site of Buto in the Delta. I'm afraid I subsequently found a better drawing of this, but sorry. That's shown essentially as a set of shrines interspersed with palms, and these are symbols that live on for millennia. In addition to all of that, you have this element here, which is a slaughtered jackal suspended from a pole. At least that's the pictorial aspect of it, let's say. These objects were made in three-dimensional materials of some sort. And you've got to the left there, that's a hieroglyph, which means making. And so it is what is presumably done for the temple of Sais is that this slaughtered jackal object is brought, and it is set up outside the temple. It is something that protects the temple and wards off people from going inside. The actual cult image would, in theory, be in there, in that building there. And in Buto, you don't even get a sense of what the cult image, what the central structure was. But you do have this. It's a very interesting detail here, because that says, probably, the arising by the gods. So you've got a plurality of gods represented, exactly how, I don't know. And then you've got two shrines of Buto to the right there. So you can get a lot of sense from all of this of how the temple, in principle, is a very small place that would be visited by the king for certain rituals, and in there would be the cult statues, which we cannot see. And it's very important that we can't see them. And the significance of some of these objects can be seen in this material. Really, the left-hand image is an important one here. You've got a flat plate, it's almost like, which has the emblem of the goddess Nate on the left, and then it has this hieroglyph, a pair of hieroglyphs for God here. And I should have pointed that out to you, that here these pairs are hieroglyphs for gods, but that is it's a flag on a pole, or a piece of cloth on a pole, which flutters in the wind and so draws attention to the building without revealing what's in there. And so you've got both the idea of a gods in general can be used for any god, and at the same time you don't see anything. You just see this fluttering symbol there. So the same thing is so important that it is then carved into this object, which, as I say, it's plate-like in shape, but it's got these ridges. Hope you can see that down the left-hand side. And so that makes it into a representation of a temple enclosure, which looks blank in the middle. It's, again, this sense of absence you get from these things. The right-hand one is just another object relating to the goddess Nate, which is so extraordinary that it's worth showing. It's not closely relevant. It is a particular sort of beetle, not a scarab, but another sort of beetle, and it's got human arms holding symbols of power. And these are fantastically beautiful objects, extremely thin, and in some sense that representation of a beetle is a representation of a deity. That drops out of fashion later. These two figures up here are also these same beetles. Something went wrong there. Oh no, it didn't. Well, it didn't go too badly wrong. I think I'll be very brief on this, just to say that this one here is what I wanted to draw attention to. You saw these images earlier. And that shows a building, a shrine, as you've had elsewhere. There it is, with a bucranium on top. And so the bucranium, the head of a bovid or an antelope, which is stuck as an emblem to draw attention, is very widespread in African symbolism generally. But you don't. It's only a symbol. It's not something that is directly worshipped or anything like that. Then you've got a ram here. And the ram is the sacred animal of the ram god of Mendes in the Delta. But with the bucranium, we have lots of parallels for it. With the ram, we don't. But I would assume that this, again, is a representation of some sort of absence, because it is all in a temple enclosure. That's the entrance on the left. And so you're not actually going to see this. You know that there's the cult in there. The ram, they may maintain a sacred ram. I think that's very likely. But the sanctuary of the temple is absent again. And we go to a small site in the Delta, Tel Ibrahim Awad, here, and these faience models of temples were found there. These are quite small objects, about this sort of size. And they have represented on the outside the same sort of symbols we've been seeing. So the pair of hieroglyphs with gods, there's another one there, and they flank an entrance on, wait, yes, it is on that one, sorry. This temple is made of flimsy materials, of reeds, something like that. And inside there would be the god. You're not going to see the god. Well, so in these early periods, you have the idea of concealment is the thing that in particular comes out of all of this. But you can then go down 1,500 years and reflect backwards on the same sort of point. Here you have a list of gods of Memphis, and details of this list show, I think, convincingly that it is based on very ancient materials. I'm not claiming that all of it is consistently based on ancient materials, but some of it is. That line across the top gives you a list of quarters of Memphis. So areas of the city where different gods would be worshipped. This could be within the city, the central city itself, or it could be scattered across the suburbs. Who knows? But there are some hieroglyphs up there. That writing of the word for west in Egyptian is not attested after the first dynasty, except in a case like this. So it is presumably a very ancient designation which is kept for at least 1,500 years after that. So you get the sense from something like this that you have an extraordinary density of worship of gods in the city, but this doesn't relate to anything that we can see on the ground because the Nile has swept the city away, and there simply isn't any archaeology. There's not zero, but there's near zero that we can relate it to. This is just a translation of bits of that column across that line across the top, showing you that these relate to other known things, including the word for Memphis itself, and the Henu bark, which relates to the god Saqqara, who is the ancient god of Memphis, and so on. We don't need to dwell on that, but we should think about how that comes to be and where it came from, and so on. And there we have a text which is a little bit later than what I want to mention here, which is the titles of a couple of high priests of this period. So, sorry, not of this period, of the middle of the Old Kingdom, 5th and early 6th dynasties, which list off a number of names of deities which are known otherwise only in that list. And so it would seem, have access to secret knowledge about who the gods are, what their names are, and that is because they are the high priests. And I've highlighted in the translation there, this is roughly contemporary with the later of those two high priests, this crucial phrase here about how in a different context, somebody will be transfigured into the next life by means of the secret writings of the god's house, where the word for house may mean also his estate or something like that. So the god, therefore, the god is worshipped in the temple, and in the temple will also be a repertory of texts which are transmitted over time, which will give meaning to all of this. Well, we're now going to move on to something quite different, thinking about how you get access to cult images in over time. In the site of Elephantine, which is the island facing Aswan, the southern end of Egypt. And there is the pavement of the temple of the goddess Satet, with, in the middle, we see this better in the next image, you've got this shaft here, which descends from this pavement to an area which is about 1,500 years older. And so as the structure developed and was rebuilt over time, they would not throw the stonework away, it would be reused in later pavements. So there's a lot of other bits of buildings have been reconstructed from these blocks that were taken away. Once you have taken absolutely everything away, which I hope was okay archaeologically, you get to that. And that is an opening in the granite boulders of the cataract, because that's what creates the cataract, is that the Nile has to go through the boulders. And you've got a human scale standing there. And you can see, I think we see this better on the next picture, that this, first the boulder on the left has been smoothed to make a kind of vertical wall. And that is, that's a very considerable task in itself if you have a piece of granite a couple of meters high. And it's also been used for centuries because it's completely blackened. Exactly how it was blackened, I don't know. Now, if we then look, well, then you will see that at the same time the area was shaped a bit, so that you went to the back of that that smoothed boulder, and you then kind of turned left, and there was a niche inside there, or something like that, and this was then cut off by this piece of walling here. And then this was in use for about 1,000 years. It then looked like that by the end of the 3rd millennium, and then we have to think, well, what does that all mean? Well, we've got two interpretations to offer you here, but I think what will make it most clear about the shape of this area is, just a second, it's this plan up here. That is the focal point of this whole area. It's very small, but it would be probably where the cult image was kept. It would be out of view, it's off axis, and the Egyptians seem to have kept their cult images off axis so that nobody could see them. Anyone who's been to the Temple of Edfu, anyone been to the Temple of Edfu? Some have. In the Temple of Edfu, on axis in the middle of the temple is a wonderful monolithic shrine of the god. The only trouble is 19th century photographs show that it was off axis then, and it was moved by people for the sake of tourists into the axis. So this idea that the god should not be seen straight ahead existed in all periods as far as we can tell. So then you've got on the right there Barry Kemp's reconstruction, where he wants there's this structure here, which you see in the plan there. He believes that you would have had a, as he puts it, the realm of the hidden image, which actually looks to me more like something like where you would keep your cult equipment, because I think the image would have been kept down there. And then you would have brought it out into the open there, and you would have set up the image for whatever purpose you were going to set it up. And then the section at the bottom, I don't think tells us much more, so we can leave that. But here is an alternative by Richard Bussmann, and I think Richard Bussmann's interpretation is probably better. So he believes that this is not a large area, and it would be spanned by beams, and it would actually be roofed, and hence you would still have that plinth there, would have a shrine on top, he suggests, and so the same basic interpretation as Barry Kemp's is also given by Richard Bussmann, with the difference that in Richard Bussmann's view, nothing of this would be public. And so you would have the cult image kept in the back, and for storage, including overnight, let's say, and the rituals would be performed on the image, which would often be moved into a more convenient space for the performance. And I think that makes better sense, really. So then we will see two images later which can give a bit more context to that. That is then what happens, that the area at the back there is sealed and a set of shrines is constructed at a later period, but still within these walls, so still not visible to the public. But people knew about this because that shaft that we saw at the beginning of this set of pictures was present until an altogether later date. So this was a really central area for people to think about their gods and keep worshipping them for 1,500 years. Here we have the temple at Tel Ibrahim Awad. I showed you those faience models, same site. And it's good to have the plan on the left, which shows you what a tiny structure this is. I should have, well, I've got something to show you which gives you perhaps a bit more sense of this. And then on the right, you have the ground plan of the temple. And here, it looks as if the main cult area would be back here, so that it would actually be behind everything else, and you would go around as kind of U shape in order to get to it. And here is the excavator's reconstruction of this. He's actually put perhaps the same sort of idea. You have here a shrine that's suggested, and then I would think that the cult area would be behind it. So in this very small space, you would still not have access to the main cult image in any meaningful way. But what would you be doing with these images? So here you have some statues of Nessa and Sepa, some of the oldest tomb statues that we know. And the really crucial one is the woman there. It's probably true of the man too, but let's look at her head there. And you can see she has these very heavy green patches under her eyes. Now, the normal material for this eye paint that was so important was malachite or some copper compound which would be ground into a powder and in this case applied to the statue to revive it for the next life. So we don't have many examples of this. Probably it was sort of thought at a later date that didn't really beautify the statue or something like that. And so this practice ceased, but it doesn't mean that the meanings that attended to it ceased. Here we are at the step pyramid, and you've got on the bottom right there a photograph of a statue, the statue of Djoser, which we saw earlier, in context where it was found, and that corresponds to that area there. Sorry, I picked out the wrong thing, it's this. And there is a cast of that statue which you can see through these peepholes. So it would have been there to receive the cult, but it would have been fundamentally invisible. And how would you have had the value of the cult? Well, next image suggests it. Here in the tomb of T at Saqqara, you have a slit, which is about this size, and you've got two men performing sensing rituals. So the aroma of the incense would go through that slit into the chamber behind, and there you have, and here we have again a copy of the statue of T, which would receive the offerings. So the presence of an actual body is very important, but it is it's a statue body. The deceased buried in the chamber underneath would receive the benefit indirectly. That only answers about 2% of what we might think about the meaning of the statues. If somebody was buried with 50 statues, obviously they couldn't all receive something like this, so we don't understand that. And people's ideas change. Here's the tomb of Mereruka, which is not more than a generation or two later than T, but he has an engaged statue which is fully visible. There might have been a door in front of that statue. I think that's quite possible, but there's only a very limited level of concealment there, except that you have these texts in these tombs which have ferocious curses against those who would enter the tomb when they shouldn't, when they weren't in a state of purity and things like that. So there are still many questions there, and I think we can't assume that people have easy access to all of this. And here is another a very nice example, I think, of this pair of people who were Nia Khnum and Khnum Hotep, were shown in that's pictures of statues. They're holding hands, which you'd find it very hard to make a pair of wooden statues like that. and they're receiving sensing. This is as they are transported to the tomb. And so, in other words, we must not take these things too literally. Not only that, but our next image may remind us that anyway the statues would have been invisible in another way, because they would have been wrapped up in cloth. And there's plenty of evidence that it would be normal for statuary to be wrapped, and it would only be unwrapped at particular points. And as you can see, that photograph there shows both the wrapped statue as found in this tomb, which is from a somewhat later date, with other objects, including that enormous battle axe at the front, and a vast amount of other cloth. So cloth becomes extremely important in thinking about what is done with bodies and things like that. And there is the statue as found on the left, and the statue as unwrapped by, perhaps it shouldn't have been done. These days you could obviously do some sort of body scan of it and you could know what it looked like without unwrapping it. But in 1905 that might not have been possible. And the lady, as she then appears, nude as you might say, is on display in the Louvre if you want to go and see her. But when we sometimes think these statues are nude, they were not nude, they were wrapped. So now let's go into later temples. Sorry, I've been talking too long. And see how you might represent this sort of thing. Now the convention in a temple is that the king is shown performing the rituals. That is a convention. It doesn't mean that the king performed the rituals. And when you read in books that the king was the sole priest who had the right to perform the rituals, that, in my opinion, is nonsense. But you do have what is being done here in the temple of Seti I at Abydos, which has the richest representations of the ordinary cult actions. The king is then unwrapping the god. And so when the god has been unwrapped as one stage in the ritual, I can see Laurel thinks he's being wrapped. Well, he's one or other. And so you would unwrap the god at the beginning of the ritual, and then you would wrap him up afterwards. That is the god Amun. And you can do that. That is a very normal picture of a god or of a human figure, let's say. Don't take the scale literally either, because the scale is governed by the convention that the two main figures have to have their heads at the same level. And so the statue of the god would be about that size, probably. But you also have other ways in which you can represent a god, such as this one here, which represents Osiris, but he is represented in the form of this jed, which is a hieroglyph meaning duration, but it's clothed. For some reason it isn't wrapped, but I'm sure somebody will have found a wrapped jed somewhere. It's also wearing a crown, so it's been turned into an animate figure by wearing clothes and being wrapped and having a crown, and it's having cloth presented to it. So again, cloth is fantastically important to the whole treatment of bodies. And then here you have really, this is the crucial picture, because this shows you the shrine in which the god is kept, which is, this is not the shrine in which he'd be kept permanently, it's the shrine in which he'd be kept for certain rituals, which is on a boat, and so it means it's a travelling shrine, and it could be carried around, but he is wrapped inside that shrine, which you can see only partially, because the shrine is wrapped. And so it's multiple layering of the body in order to protect it. And here is the counterexample. So here you have Min, we had him right at the beginning, and Min is carried out in procession by a whole group of priests, but he's not wrapped, and he's totally visible. And if we take the scale seriously, which I'm slightly inclined to do here, maybe not that seriously, but he would be roughly life size, if you can say what life size is for a god. So the figure of Min is roughly the size of the human figures in the picture. But the human figures are wrapped instead of Min being wrapped. So there's a sort of reverse symbolism here, that the min is so important that he has to be shown in a different status from the people who are carrying him. If you're carrying a shrine, top left, then these priests are shown in ordinary clothes, and bottom left, a couple of priests carrying an emblem of min, being the lettuce patch. They are again in ordinary clothes. But I think the fact that the human figures carrying min around are concealed by this cloth is part of the same sort of message as we've had throughout, but in reverse. And so the ithyphallic god Min is a protective figure. He is so protective that he doesn't need to be wrapped, and he can be shown publicly. And we actually have, as far as I know, I can't think of any statue of a god in Egypt which comes from outside a temple, with the exception of those colossal statues of Min, and if you have this one here, this would be carried out of the temple and visible. And there are parallels for this. It's not unique for Min, that is. And then from the side of Herakleon in the Delta, there is a colossal statue of what I would call a fecundity figure, a personification of the inundation, which is 4 meters high, or a bit more, I think. The largest such statue known anywhere, but this is not a normal deity at all. So we should assume, therefore, that deities are kept inside temples and that they are not shown publicly, as it were. And then my last few images show you the weirdness side of things. So we're now going right down to the 4th century, and you have register after register on this naos from the Delta of images of deities. And these deities, as you can see, are often shown on plinths. And those plinths don't really tell us anything. It's just that, again, you've got to have the figures at a certain height above the register line. But these are completely weird figures. And you have elements like a tree down there, which is presumably some sacred tree. You've got 2 snakes up there, and the snakes are in special shrine-like things. And a very interesting one is this one here, where you have a nursing woman underneath a tree. And that is some composite image, probably signifying the goddess Isis bringing up the god Horus in the Delta marshes, or something like that. And at the temple of Hibis in Kharga Oasis, there are literally hundreds of these figures. And so we have to assume that this is actually what cult imagery really looked like. And people point out that if you go into churches in Italy, you have all the enormous number of paintings and things in them. They show scenes from lives of saints and all these other things that they show, but the figures are normal human figures. But then there are figures which are actually venerated in churches, and these are often multimedia figures that have clothing and are weird in other ways. So the boundaries of artistic representation are breached by particular really sacred things. And here, same context as the last one, you have some figures. You've got crossed arrows against a shield, and you've got 4 of them there, and some of them have heads on top of them. And those crossed arrows against the shield are emblems of the goddess Nate, with whom we saw right at the beginning. So these are images which are extremely important, so important that they've stayed for nearly 3,000 years without very major change. And again, I would say that that's where a lot of cult importance lies. And so we have to remember that the repertory that we actually see is only part of what existed. And my last image, this is really just for fun here, although it has one significant point to it also. That is an image of the god Har-Somtus, who is one of the junior gods in the temple of Dendera. And it's got a caption above it. That's what's particularly relevant for thinking about this. It says gold, and then there's a word of uncertain reading, and then it says height 4 palms. And so, so 4 palm width, so it's about that size. And it is this statue, which signifies the god Harsomptus, in the form of an enormous lotus with a snake coming out of it, which then curves around. Well, it's not very enormous, because as I said, it's actually rather small. And the standing figure on the left is actually 2 figures, layered over each other. They would be attendant gods who would carry this object around. This altogether is presumably some sort of occult image. But the entertaining side of it is that an Austrian published a book about 20 years ago saying that these were ancient Egyptian pictures of light bulbs. And so he thought that in antiquity, it is awfully dark in Egyptian temples. They were lit with electric light. So I will leave you with that very irrelevant thought. It's more fun to have that.
Take a question.
Yeah.
We have time for a question or two before we prepare to. Well, I actually want to challenge you on just a tiny little point,
Right.
which is your you don't think that the Hierakonpolis statue of the falcon is a god, and one of the arguments you put forth is that it could be put on a standard.
Yeah.
We have, of course, multiple contemporary representations of standards acting as divinities in some
That's
way.
true, yeah.
And certainly later on, you point to other cases in which divinities travel out of their temple.
No.
Later on, this is
Yeah.
happening on the backs of priests or
Yeah.
with boats. And I wonder if, in fact, we might not have a cult image of a god that can be put on and taken off of a pole, one for sitting at home and one for going out in procession.
Well, I'm not saying it's not an image of a god. I'm just saying it's not the principal cult
Why not?
image. But I mean, your interpretation is certainly possible.
Okay.
But we just can't tell. Is
It's
the
not
answer
weird
to
enough for you, is it?
that? That could be it. I think that having the figure of the king on the front would be surprising, because the king, I think, would be facing away from the god, and so would be being protected by the god. Whereas if you have an object which is used in the cult, I would expect there wouldn't be a figure of the king, because the officiant, the person who actually performs the ritual, would take the role of the person who cares for the god, and that wouldn't really fit that. But yes, I can certainly be wrong on that.
I had a question about the temple in Tel Ibrahim Awad.
Yeah.
And so you would describe it as an Egyptian temple with this like offset entrance, actually, and you're probably aware of other interpretations as a Near Eastern influence for that temple in the Delta?
Well, obviously, it's in the Eastern Delta. But I don't think anything that was found in the temple is un-Egyptian looking like among the artifacts. So I'd be inclined to say, well, it could be that it's influenced from elsewhere. But of course, it's outside the range of what we normally have. So if its architecture is Near Eastern, it would certainly fit with Egyptian ideas, and so.
Actually, I've always found that building really interesting, and in fact, if you put that next to the Saqqara temple, I find them really the earliest Saqqara temples. I actually find that sort of 2-room bent axis. I know it's the bent axis, straight axis thing.
Yeah.
But one parallel I've seen there also is with the cult buildings inside funerary enclosures of the First Dynasty, which are generally 2 rooms with a bent axis, and it's the second room that has the cult image in it there as well, which would maybe have a parallel between the and royal cult in the same sort of.
Well, that makes sense.
Structure.
Yes, I think you don't get straight axes in temples before the second millennium, anyway.
How many temples we have?
Well,
but yeah, no, I know.
Yes.
I have a rather odd question, and one probably coming out of a certain amount of ignorance, being a non-Egyptologist. What's going on with the lack of footwear, right? I see with the Narmer palette that at least the king has a sandal bearer. But if we're talking about this relationship between power, clothing, cloth, why are the feet left out of it?
I think the same basic idea exists as in Islam. In other words, you purify yourself before you go into a temple, and you take off your footwear. So people have now identified rooms next to a royal palace where it seems this would be a removing your footwear room before going into the presence of the king. And you clearly have cases where there's a status implication of who is wearing footwear and who isn't. But I think basically it's the pure no footwear is the normal thing. Now that's odd for the Nama Palit in the sense that he hasn't got any footwear, but he's got somebody to bring it with him. But I would think that it's very difficult to say, but perhaps something like this, it's a ritual action that he's performing, even though it isn't a ritual action that you would have inside a temple or anything, but it's kind of taken away from a context in which something so mundane as a shoe would be relevant. But the idea that somebody carries your shoe is, of course, very prestigious, and that has, in many cultures, of course, the idea that if you touch anything that touches the king, you have to be somebody of very high status, and you have to be protected from the possible danger that this brings with it, and so on. So the image of the message given by royal footwear is that it separates the king from other people, roughly. Is that anything like an answer?
I think if you have further questions, I will invite you to ask them of John over a glass of wine. Thank you so much for joining.